Edexcel, June 2017, paper 1. Okay, so let's get started with question 1. So this is a table question. Table questions are notorious for just being difficult to process, difficult to actually understand what it's asking you, but let's see how this one goes. So the table shows market data for e-cigarettes. The original equilibrium price is £23. That might be relevant, so I'm going to underline that. But they haven't actually asked me the question yet, but I'm just trying to figure out what's actually going on in this table. So we have prices, quantity demanded per month, which is in thousands. So we have quantity demanded, we have quantity supplied per month. Okay, and then we have new quantity demanded and new quantity supplied. So we just have to work out base. I'm guessing, we don't know the question yet, but they're going to give us some change and we're going to have to work out the new quantity demanded, new quantity supplied. And just keep in mind, guys, it's in thousands. But yeah, let's read what the question is actually asking us. So before reading this, I'm actually going to read the question because it's going to give you more context, and that is something I'd always suggest you do. Read the question, and then read the because this is going to tell you how to answer it basically. So read the question so you kind of know what you're looking for in there. So if I read this straight away, I'm going to underline things, but I'm not going to know what I'm looking for basically. So let's read the question first. So calculate the new equilibrium price and quantity following the successful advertising campaign and the fall in production costs. Use the last two columns. Okay, so I'm calculating the new equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so but let's now read the stimulus thing we have. So as a result of a successful advertising campaign, demand increased by 3,000. Okay, that looks quite relevant. At all prices. Okay, demand increased 3,000 at all prices. So now what I'm actually going to do to make this a bit easier, I'm going to go back to my table. I'm going to do something like this. So demand increased, so increased 3,000 at all prices. Okay, so that will give me a good little annotation there. And then at the same time, production costs fell, leading to an increase in supply of 1,000 of cigarettes at all prices. Okay, so production costs fell, need to increase in supply at all prices. So that's going to lead to 1,000 more at each price. Okay, so now let's actually tackle the question. So like I said, these questions are sometimes a bit hard to interpret. So it's just about trying to rack your brain around them. And it's just practice, honestly. The more you do, the better you'll get at them, because you'll actually kind of understand, because they all are very similar. They all kind of ask the same thing. So as the question says, we have 3,000 more quantity demanded at every price, and we have 1,000 more quantity supplied at each price. So let's work out the new quantity demanded and the new quantity supplied. So the new quantity demanded will just be so 5 plus 3 is 8, and then the new quantity supplied is going to be 10. So I'm just going to work out this table, so this should be quite simple now. 9 and 9. Okay, that looks like it actually is the answer, because it's asking us to work out, if you remember back to the question, calculate the new equilibrium price and quantity following the successful advertising campaign. So it looks like we have actually got that, but let's just fill in the rest of the table just for completeness. To 7, so that's 10, and that would be 8, and then we have 11, and we have 7, and then we have 12, and we have 6. So that is the table completed. Now let me just go back and look at what the question's actually asking me. Calculate the new equilibrium price. The new equilibrium price, obviously, what does it mean by equilibrium price, by the way? Where do we find equilibrium if we think about a supply and demand curve? So price, quantity, supply, demand. Where is equilibrium? Equilibrium is at that point. And what does that point mean? It's where the two curves intersect. Where the two curves intersect, the quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So the same quantity. So that is why £24 is going to be the equilibrium price. So I'm just going to write that. £24. And then what else is asking me? So calculate the new equilibrium price and quantity, and the new equilibrium quantity would be 9,000. Remember, the units, like I said earlier, they are in thousands, 9,000. I don't think there's anything else to write there, to be honest. And that's pretty much it. And that would get you 4 marks, because you'd remember it is a calculate question. There's no marks for economics theory. There's no marks for anything like that. It's just about calculating what they've asked you to calculate, and they've asked you to do 2 things here. So equilibrium price and quantity, and that's pretty much it. And then perfect. And that would get you 4 marks. Do not dwell on this. Do not spend any longer trying to add economics theory because you think you need to, because it's an economic exam. No, if the question's command word is calculate, all you need to do is give them numbers they're asking you and move on. Moving on to 1B is a multiple choice question, so let's have a read of it. Research conducted in New Zealand estimated cross elasticity of demand. So that tells me XCD straight away is probably going to be used. For e-cigarettes remember, what is XCD? Cross elasticity of demand. You're comparing 2 goods, so one of the goods is probably going to be e-cigarettes. Cross elasticity demand of e-cigarettes to be 0.16. That's given me probably something I need. In response to changes in the price of tobacco. Okay, changes in the price of tobacco. So they've given me the two goods here, I'm guessing. So e-cigarettes is gonna be one of them, and changes in the price of tobacco. Let's write out the XCD formula quickly because it'll probably make it a bit easier. So percentage change in quantity demanded of good A, or like whatever it is of good A divided by percentage change in price of good B. Okay, let's read the rest of the question. This implies that there's a 5% increase in the price of tobacco. That's probably another stat we're going to have to use. 5% increase in the price of tobacco, which will cause the percentage change in quantity demanded for e-cigarettes to be. Okay, so now this sounds quite complex, but let's break this down let's read it again from the start. So we've highlighted the important parts, which is a good thing now. So let's just basically read what we've highlighted. The XCD of demand for e-cigarettes is 0.16. So they've told us the XCD value. So let's get that down. So 1.6, we're basically filling in our formula. And there's a lot of these types of questions where they get you to basically manipulate the formula. So now, we've got the XCD value. Let's keep reading. Response to changes in the price of tobacco. So we're talking about the price of tobacco. So now, if we look at the XCD formula, there is a very small technicality with it. So it's percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by percentage change in price of good B. So if we're talking about price, we must be talking about good B. So in response to change in price of good B, so now it then tells us the value which price changes. So there's a 5% increase in the price of tobacco. That means that is going to fill in the bottom of our formula. So now basically what the question is asking you this value. So it's asking you X. So what does that value equal? Now the way you calculate that is just it's like GCSE maths. I don't have my calculator with me, so I have to use my phone, but the way you calculate it is just 0.1, I can't type, it's 0.16 times 5, and then that would give us 0.8, and 0.8 is obviously C, which will be the answer here. So like I would do, so 0.16 times 5 equals 0.8, and that would be the correct answer. Okay, so moving on to question 2. So let's have a read of this question. Again, I'm going to start with the actual question and then go on to the stimulus. So assume that the change in the quantity of tea purchased was only caused by a change in the price of tea. Okay, so that's just an assumption. I don't think I'm going to have to use that. So calculate the PED. So it's asking me PED. Let's get that written down just for the video sake. So percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Okay, so calculate the PED for tea in response to right. So basically, all this question is asking you is calculate the PED. So let's work. So this will now tell us how to calculate it. Well, the numbers to use. So between 2010 and 2015, the average price of tea increased from £7.20 to £8.48 per kilo. So we increased from £7.20, and remember, to calculate percentage change, you need the change. So percentage change is change divided by original times 100. I must really be annoying some A-level maths people here. But yeah, so let's calculate the change. So the change would simply be, if we do it on our calculator, it is £8.48 take away £7.20 divided by, because remember, we increased from £7.20 to £7.20 is our original, and let's quickly calculate that on the calculator. Okay, so the change there is, as it shows, it's £1.28, and that £1.28, what am I going to do to it? I'm going to divide it by £7.20 here, which is going to give me the value of 0.17. So 0.178, I'll say, just to round it up. So 0.178, what is this now? This is the percentage change in price. So if you remember back to the PED formula, price is at the bottom. So I'm just going to slap that in the bottom there. So 0.178 divided by, now we still need to calculate the top value, which is percentage change in quantity demanded, and I think that says this later on. So over the same period, the quantity of tea purchased fell. So the quantity of tea purchased fell, which means the value should be negative technically, but a lot of the time, or most of the time, Edexcel, they don't actually care whether you give the PED value negative or positive, but that's besides the point. Over the same period, the quantity of tea purchased fell from 97 million kilos to 76 million kilos. And again, it's just about, the reason why I just read this slightly attentively, you want to get the original right, because if you don't get what was original right for the percentage change formula, you're going to mess the entire thing up. So the tea purchase from 97 to 76. So remember, if we fell from 97, 97 must be the original. So then I will just work that out. Let me slap down my calculator. And that has given me the entire equation, has given me 0.216. So now this is my PED. And let's just divide them up. So 0.216 divided by 0.178. And that is going to give me a nice whole number value of 1.216. So I'm just going to round that up to 1.22. And that is my PED value. And that is 2A done, so let's move on to 2B. So calculate the change, so change in total sales, so we're talking about sales here, so total sales revenue actually. So calculate the change in total sales revenue for UK tea retailers between 2010 and 2015. Okay, so in 2010, if we're trying to work out sales, like I said, price and quantity, in 2010 our prices were £7.20 and our quantity demanded was 97 million, so simply 7.2 times 97 would be our first one, and then we have £8.48 times 76. Now, one thing to be careful of is the kilos are in millions, so make sure at the end we do need to add our units. So just slap them into my calculator. So the revenue is for, in 2010 is 698.4 million, and then in 2015 it was 644.5 million, and then of course, to get the answer is asking for a change. It's a simple take 988 away from 644. So now if you look at these numbers, in 2010 our sales revenue was 698 million point four, and in 2015 our sales revenue is 644.5 million. Now what does this show? It shows that sales revenue has fallen over those 5 years. So now we need to make sure, and I'm sure one of the points in the mark scheme will be to get the full 2 marks, you will have to give a negative number. So of course 644.5 take away 698.4 will give you the last answer, and that will give us minus 53.9. and remember, we do need to include our unit, millions, you can say whatever, change in total sales, and that is our answer. I just want to make that clear to the examiner, and perfect. That is all you need for that question. 2C is a little multiple choice question. So estimates for the demand of black tea in the UK suggest it is an inferior good. This implies the good has a negative, and it's giving you basically all the different elasticities of demand. So let's break this down. So cross elasticity demand, what is that to do with? Cross elasticity demand is to do with substitutes and complements. So it's not really to do with inferior goods, so we're going to get rid of that. We'll skip past B. PED is to do with price and just quantity demanded. It's not to do with that, and same with PES, is to do with price, quantity demanded. Then what is Y? So income elasticity demand, or more commonly known as YED. What is YED to do with? Is to do with inferior goods and then normal goods. So yes, the answer for this would be B. Moving on to question 3, and just looking at it, I can just tell it's an absolute classic, and I can't even start to tell you how many students drop marks on this. But let's get started. So starting with actually reading the question, calculate the domestic cooking subsidy. So subsidy paid daily by the Indian government. So we're trying to work out a subsidy amount. Now, what is a subsidy? It's a grant to producers, basically where the government gives money to producers to produce more. The main things I'm going to catch you out with these diagram questions, look at the axes. So this price per cylinder is in rupees, and then the quantity of gas cylinders is daily, and it's in millions. So that's a big one. So always look at the units. So reading the stimulus, it doesn't give me much. So yeah, there's no need to read the stimulus. So basically, what's the question asking me? Calculate the subsidy amount paid daily, and that's all they want. It's another calculate question. So the way we do this is take 1023, which is the price here, take that away from 455, which would give us, on my calculator, this would give us 568 rupees, and I would then divide that, I would then times that by 1.8, but then of course, because that's the quantity of cylinders, so I times that by 1.8, but that would of course be millions, and then that would give me my answer. So my answer would be 10224 million, and that is the subsidy paid daily by the Indian government. Alright, so I'm sure a lot of you are quite confused, so I went through that entire thing without any explanation on purpose, but now let's actually get down to explain it. So the Indian government want to subsidise these gas cylinders for Indian firms to produce more. They want them to increase their production from 1.5 to 1.8, and that is the main thing. They want them to increase production. But simply, for an Indian firm to produce 1.8 million cylinders before the subsidy, what price do they want? And how do you get that? So before the subsidy, to produce 1.8 million cylinders, the Indian firm wants 1,023 rupees. And that is the reason why we use this number, because this is the price the Indian firm wants before the subsidy. So 1,023 rupees is the price per cylinder an Indian firm wants to produce 1.8 million quantity of gas cylinders. So there we were focusing on the supply curve. Now let's look at the demand curve. At 1.8 million cylinders, how much do consumers want to pay? So we go from 1.8 million, we go up to the demand curve, and that is exactly 455. Now, that is where we get the numbers from. Let's think about this. Firms charge 1,023 rupees at 1.8 million quantity of gas cylinders. Consumers only want to pay 455 at 1.8 million. So who covers that difference? That is the government, and that is the subsidy. So that's why we take away those two numbers to get us 568, which is the subsidy per cylinder for the government. And as we know, there's 1.8 million cylinders, so we times them together, which will give us 1,022.4 million that the government is paying every day in a subsidy. This is a bit of a trickier question than other Section A questions, but if you just understand the basics, at 1.8 million, firms want to charge 1,023 rupees, but also on the opposite side of the spectrum, at 1.8 million units, consumers only want to pay 455 rupees. And remember, we're talking about subsidies, so who has to cover that gap? Where is that discrepancy? How is that discrepancy going to be matched? That is the government, and they're going to provide that quantity of subsidy. Okay, so let's tackle the rest of this question. So calculate the percentage change, which sounds quite important. Percentage change of the total subsidy received by consumers and producers. So of course, subsidy is going to affect both consumers and producers, so let's work this out. So total subsidy, we have already worked out the total subsidy, which is this number here. So that is 568, because remember, this is just timesing it by the quantity. This is the actual amount daily paid by the Indian government, but this is the actual amount of the subsidy. Okay, so we have already calculated the total amount of the subsidy, which would be 568. Now we just need to work out basically how much the consumers got, and then we can use that to work out how much the producers got. So if we look at consumers, let's just work out the difference. So 526 take away 455, and it would be great if I had a calculator. That would give us 71. So what I'd do, so it's just 71 divided by 568 times 100, and if we work that out, which I cannot, would give us 12.5%. Now, what you can do to make it really easy, if consumers receive 12.5%, all the rest must be producers. So if you take away 100, take away 12.5%, it means producers are going to receive 87.5%. Okay, so moving on to the last bit of this question. One effect of a subsidy is do subsidies increase consumer surplus? Yes. Do they increase market failure? It's the opposite. Why do we implement subsidies? Used usually in positive externalities, where we want to encourage the consumption of goods with positive externalities. So they do not increase market failure, they try to reduce market failure. So public good provision. Do we use subsidies for public good provision? No, it's usually state provision. And then one effect of subsidies to increase tax revenue? Not quite. Subsidies actually use up tax revenue, which is wrong. Therefore, the answer would have been A. Okay, moving on to question 4. Draw a cost and revenue diagram, which is basically the way I think about cost and revenue diagrams. I just think about a monopoly diagram, but that's just how I remember it. But yeah, cost and revenue diagram to show the likely impact of a reduction in sales on a basic construction equipment JCB's profits. So a reduction in sales on a firm's profits. So if we think about sales, what is a reduction in sales going to cause? What is it going to affect? A reduction in sales is going to affect demand, isn't it? So it's going to affect our demand equals AR curve, and then because it affects our average revenue, it will also affect our MR curve. So they are the two curves that a reduction in sales will affect. If we think about this R word, what does R stand for? R stands for revenue. So in demand equals AI stands for average revenue, and in MR it stands for marginal revenue. And how do we get revenue? What is the formula for revenue? Revenue is sales times quantity. Therefore, if we have a reduction in sales, that means obviously we're going to have a reduction in revenue. But yeah, let's get started here by drawing a monopoly diagram or a cost and revenue diagram, however you call it. So cost / revenue on your y-axis, revenue, and then quantity on your x-axis. And let's get a monopoly diagram drawn, or a cost revenue diagram, whatever you want to call it. So I always start with my D equals AR, so demand equals AR. Then we have our MR curve, which is twice as steep. Then we have our AC curve. And what is the only rule with the MC curve? The MC curve needs to intersect AC at its lowest point. So something like that does suffice. And now we're talking about reduction sales affecting a firm's profits. So let's just quickly label up JCB's profits here. Where do firms profit maximize? Profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR, which is that point right here. And then how do we work out a firm's supernormal profits? We go from MC equals MR, we keep going up until we hit our AR curve. And when we hit our AR curve, we go left from there. And that will tell us a price at where we profit maximize. So I'm going to label that P max now, and then go down from that point to give us Q max. But now, how do we find that box of supernormal profit? We go up from that Q max quantity and we keep going up until we hit our AC curve, until we hit our costs. So let's label that up there. And now this will be our box of supernormal profit before a reduction in sales. And why is that the box supernormal profit? Because this tells us the price they sell at, and then this tells us the costs. So anything above the costs is the profits. But now let's work out what happens after a reduction in sales. So how would I show that on a diagram? Like I said, we're going to shift two curves in, which is our D equals AR curve and our MR curve. So let's do that here. So we'll shift that to there. So D1 equals AR1. And then we'll shift our MR curve in also, which will look something like this. So I'm going to label that MR1 now. So now that's our two curves shifted in. That's nearly all the question done. But now we just need to do the last bit, which is again looking at the impact on the firm's profits. So again, same thing, just with two different curves now. So where the firm's profit maximize, where MC equals MR. So that would be this point here. And then what do we do from there? Same thing as last time. Just basically the only reason you drop marks here is by getting confused. So you go up from the MC equals MR point until you hit your new AR curve, which is obviously D equals AR1. And then you go left from there. So that would be P max 1, I'm going to label it. And then from MR1, you would go up, well, you can label up Q max 1 as well. But then you go up to find the costs, which would just be around there. So now, what does this show overall? So a reduction in sales, therefore a reduction in revenue. How has this affected a firm's profits? As you see, this is the blue box of supernormal profit, and this is the red box. So it shows that when a firm receives a reduction in sales, their supernormal profit is going to fall. Now, I would just write a line saying that a supernormal profit would fall, just to answer the question directly after a reduction in sales. Or you can show it in your diagram. You could say like, whatever, one box is bigger than the other box. But yeah, that is pretty much enough for 4 marks. And if you get something like that, you should be quite happy, because that is a very simple question to pick up 4 marks on. But with this question, you do not want to be dropping any marks, and the only way you can drop marks is simple mistakes like axes or not labeling your curves, especially here when you're adding your new AR MR curve. You need to make sure that you add them correctly, label everything, label the box supernormal profit. Okay, and just moving on to the next question. So it's a multiple choice question. So let's have a read of this. In India, JCB has a strong brand image, and 50% market share. So that's kind of maybe a telltale sign or something. So 50% market share in construction equipment. This means that the construction equipment market in India is likely to have a low level of... Okay, so we need to complete this statement basically. So it's likely to have a low level of concentration. So the construction equipment in India is likely to have a low level of concentration. Well, the stimulus directly contradicts that, saying that JCB has 50% market share, which obviously shows very high concentration, so that's wrong. Then we have B, which is contestability. So this means that construction equipment in India is likely to have a very low level of contestability. I agree, because of the same reasons last time. JCB has 50% market share, which could indicate there is very low levels of contestability. It's very like monopoly power-esque. C, Construction equipment in India is likely to have a low level of private ownership. In both of these stimuluses, it says nothing about private ownership, so that's not a conclusion we can take. And then is likely to have a low level of specialization. Again, doesn't mention anything. Specialization obviously is kind of just nothing to do with this. So yeah, for this question, my answer would be B. Moving on to question 5. It looks like we've got a cup of coffee in front of us, but let's go straight to the question. Let's not waste any time reading this. We'll read it when it becomes relevant. Let's go straight to which of the following is a fixed cost to Starbucks. Now this is very simple content knowledge, so it's just the difference in a fixed and a variable cost. Variable cost, of course, vary with output, so something like coffee cups. As the more coffee you sell, the more coffee cups you'll need, whereas fixed costs do not vary with output. So let's try onto this. So coffee is going to be a variable cost, so we're going to say no. Milk is also going to be a variable cost. Packaging is also going to be a variable cost, and therefore the answer has to be rent. And why is rent a fixed cost? As if Starbucks sell one coffee versus if they sell 1 million coffees this month, the rent for that shop is not going to change. So it's not varying with output, therefore it is a fixed cost. Moving on to the next question. So this is question 5B. Explain the difference between a fixed and a variable cost. And that is basically exactly what we've just said. Just define, so fixed costs being costs that do not vary with output, then variable costs being costs which vary with output. I've just written fixed costs do not change with output, whereas variable costs can increase or decrease. So basically, variable cost can vary with output. Moving on to 5C. So last 2 marks here for section A. So with reference to figure 1, calculate the profit in pence, and I can just tell straight away that's going to be a big thing, because if it's asking you specifically for some units, always make sure you remember that, because that is probably where most people will drop a mark. But yeah, let's see. To calculate the profit in pence for a cappuccino drink, you got advice to show your working. So this is why I advise to go straight to the questions, because now we actually need to use this. I'm guessing this bit. We need to use this bit of the extract. But if you read that straight away and then you go on to answer these 2 questions, by the time you get to 5C, so this question anyway, you're going to have probably forgotten it. It's just a waste of time. So only read things when you need them, when it's relevant. So 5C, calculate the profit in pence for a cappuccino drink. So first, if we read it, if you look at the start of it, it tells us the price of a cappuccino drink, which is £2.27. But now, if you remember what I was saying earlier, it says calculate the profit in pence. So if it's £2.27, that means this is 227 pence. Since of course there's 100 pennies in a pound. So now let's calculate the profit. So what does this show us? So this shows us all of the costs, I guess. Okay, so at the bottom, they tell us there's 13% profit. So that should be quite easy now. So how are we going to calculate the amount of profit from this £2.27? What we are going to do, we're going to take 227, we're going to divide it by 100 and times it by 13. And that should give us the profit Starbucks makes from each cappuccino drink in pence. So I'm just going to make sure to give it the pence sign, and that would be my answer. And that's all you need to do for section A. So that is how to get 25 out of 25 on your section A. Now, of course, I've been doing economics a lot longer than you guys have, so it comes quite easy to me, but I've seen it with my students. All you need to do is practice. So try to get through, especially before your paper 1 and paper 2, try to get through every single section A. Wherever you drop a mark in section A, try to analyse, understand why you dropped that mark, and then next time make sure you do not drop that mark. And that just constant repetition, that constant cycle of rectifying your mistakes should hopefully, in your real exam, get you to those full marks or somewhere near full marks. As you remember, section A questions repeat all the time, so you really want to make sure if you drop a mark, you understand why you dropped it. So next time, if that comes up in your real paper, you are not dropping that mark. Okay, now for most students, we would say the easier section is done. Moving on to probably the most difficult section of the paper, which is section B, which I actually find the best part of the paper, because I believe it's the most skillful part of the paper, where the top level students can differentiate themselves from the lower level students, but obviously with it being the most skillful, it is the most difficult. So let's have a shot at this section B. Like I always do, I'm going to go straight to the questions and then use the extracts from the questions. So let's get started with this 5-mark question. So let's try to analyse this question and actually see what it's asking us. So with reference to figure 1 and the extract, so it wants us to use both these figures. That's quite an important point. Explain one reason. So like I said in my 5-mark structure video, if you haven't checked that out, check that out. It's usually 1 KAA paragraph for your 5-mark question. But okay, so explain one likely reason for the change in the four firm concentration ratio in the supermarket sector between 2010 and 2015. So like I said, haven't read any of the extracts yet, but a really good practice and a really good thing I suggest to students for section B is before you even read the extracts, once you've read the question, just try to use your economics knowledge, try to use your just real world knowledge, try to tackle the question itself, and then you can use the extracts to back it up, maybe to support your argument. So here, it's asking us a reason for the change in the concentration ratio of the supermarket sector. So I'm going to start building my paragraph up straight away. So with the 5 marker, like I said, it's a KA paragraph. My knowledge mark here is probably going to just be defining concentration ratios. I'm just going to define what a concentration ratio is, what it means. I'm maybe giving a little example. Application, like I said, application mark here is probably going to be given because it's talking about one reason for the change in the 4 firm concentration ratio, and it tells us to use figure 1 and extract A. So if you look at extract A, that is this, and I'm not going to read this yet, but figure 1. Yeah, so figure 1 says 2010 and 2015. It tells us the difference between the concentration ratios there and between 2015. So what I'm going to do for my application is probably just state the change in concentration ratio. So for my analysis, the command word here is explain. So I need to give one reason for the change. Now this is where I'm going to use my extracts, and of course it tells me to use figure 1 and extract A, and the only worded one there is going to be extract A. So let's have a look at extract A and see if it can give us any reason for the change in supermarkets concentration ratios. Okay, here. So the market shares of the big 4 supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, are under pressure by shopping habits changing. So that's quite a general statement, to be fair, but it could be a reason. Many consumers are switching from one weekly shop to more frequently at local discount stores. And I understand every single person doing Edexcel Economics might not actually live in England, but if you do live in England and you are involved in the real world, you will probably know that Aldi and Lidl, they're known as like the discount supermarkets. People go there because it's cheaper, whereas Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, they sell more branded things which are a bit more expensive. So this is basically telling me consumers are switching shopping habits, and why they're switching shopping habits? Because it's cheaper. So the one reason, and my explanation, my KAA, my analysis part of my KAA is basically going to be explaining why consumers are changing from the big incumbents, so the Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, to now the local discount stores such as Aldi and Lidl. Okay, so the way I would word all of that in my analysis is, like I said, I'd reuse the words in the question. So one reason, I would have given my application, and I'll basically writing this bit out. So I'd say one likely reason for the change in the 4 firm concentration ratio is due to consumers' shopping habits changing and consumers switching towards lower priced discount stores. Maybe a decent link here could be, you can link it to like the law of demand. So obviously if you look at a demand curve, we have price, we have quantity. As price increases, quantity demanded falls. So you can basically maybe link it to that due to discount stores, obviously they're selling at lower prices, there's more quantity demanded. But what I would say, so like I said before, consumers are switching to discount supermarkets. With consumers switching to discount supermarkets, this means the quantity demanded of the Asda, Sainsbury's, all the big supermarkets is falling, because think about it, if consumers are switching, there's less sales, there's less revenue, therefore less profits, and that is going to mean if they're generating less sales, less revenue, less profit, they have less market share. Whereas the smaller discount stores such as Lidl and Aldi, they're getting more sales, more revenue, more profit, thus their concentration ratio, which is just their market share is essentially increasing because they have more sales. Is that it mentions that these discount stores are local. So I guess you could say consumers are switching because it's more local, but honestly, it probably will be a mark, but it doesn't really make sense if you think about the actual geography of England. Pretty much all these supermarkets are spread around everywhere. But if we just think about marks, you can probably say also they're a bit more local, and you could probably mention this bit as well, buying goods online from other grocery retailers. But yeah, that is more than enough for 5 marks. And yeah, like I said, this is how easy it is and how simple it is to break down these questions. And like you should be, like I said, this is why I always say 5 minutes is maximum for 5 markers, and you really can get these done in less than 5 minutes. As I have obviously spent this long because I'm explaining this step by step. Okay, moving on to 6B. So this is a 12-mark question. So we're getting on to a bit of the more meaty questions. So let's have a read of this. So with reference to figure 2 and extract A, so again, very nice of them to give us exact figures to look at. So when it gives you something like this, when when it prompts you what to look at, I will literally just look at them two because that's where the examiner wants you to look at, basically. But with reference to figure 2 and extract A, discuss the possible impact. So this is an impact question. So it'll come with the exam technique, but when it's asking for impacts, a lot of them should be actually in the extract. So remember, you're looking for impacts. To discuss the possible impact of the supermarket monopoly power, that's quite interesting. Supermarket monopoly power on both food suppliers and consumers. So on both food suppliers and consumers. Okay. So now, this is actually, it looks like quite a tricky question for consumers, for students. Why? Because most students learn monopoly power in terms of labour markets. So they learn it, for example, the NHS exploits doctors, exploits nurses with this monopoly power to push down wages. But also, a lot of students forget that monopoly power also exists in labour markets, but also exists in buyer markets. So this is a great example where supermarkets, since they're the sole buyer of like food, for example, food supplies, they can exploit the food suppliers. So there's food suppliers in the supermarkets. The supermarkets are the only ones that buy that food supply off the food suppliers. So a better, less tongue twister example is Network Rail. So they maintain all the railway infrastructure in England. So like the actual like tracks and stuff like that. So every single place in England, in Great Britain, is the railway tracks, the infrastructure is owned by Network Rail. This means for the actual train tracks, the suppliers of train tracks in Great Britain only have one supply to sell to, which is Network Rail. Therefore, Network Rail exerts monopoly power because it has power to push down the price they can pay these railway suppliers, as they are the only buyer of these like rail tracks. So they were a bit of a side note, but there's some good real world examples of monopoly power, especially in buyer markets. But yeah, back to the question. To discuss the possible impact of supermarket monopoly power on the food suppliers and then on consumers as well. So this is, so to get full marks, to get anywhere near full marks in this question, because it says and, you're going to have to mention the impacts on both suppliers and then separately on consumers. So I actually remember in extract A we were reading at the start of it. So let's look for food supplies firstly. So in extract A, I remember this part of the paragraph. It was actually talking about the effects, the monopoly power effects on food supplies. And let me just try to find where that was. So yeah, food supplies are struggling to remain in business since supermarkets are engaging in intense price wars, which of course states the relationship between the suppliers and the supermarkets themselves. So basically, if supermarkets are cutting price, the suppliers are being affected. Okay, here's a good line. It blames aggressive, so the UK's food suppliers, they're blaming aggressive price cutting by the supermarkets and delays in payment to food suppliers. Now that is a very good impact, if I was to say so myself. So aggressive price cutting by supermarkets and the delays in payments to food supplies. So you can say one impact of the monopoly power is that because they have this power, because these food supplies cannot sell to anyone else, they're exploiting their power by doing things like delays in payment to food supplies. And then if you just continue reading, another impact here, so further problems include food supplies being forced to pay excessive amounts of packaging. That's another impact. So for excessive amounts of packaging, what is that? Packaging is a cost, so it means that costs are rising for these food suppliers. And this is where like you kind of build a chain of analysis. If costs are rising, and like it says here, a lot of these guys are small, medium-sized businesses. If costs are rising, what could happen? The simplest one is that they could just close down. They might be forced to shut down because there might not be enough profit in the market for them to continue. They might not be making enough sales. Or you could also say, if costs are rising, what else could happen? It means that the quality of goods being produced could decrease, because since if costs are rising, they can either continue producing the same quality and just take lower profit margins, or they could lower their quality, therefore mean that costs also lower and keep the same profit margins. So there's quite a few points there for the suppliers, and pretty much what I would do with this question, by the way, I'll probably do one KAA, because of course a 12 marker, you do a KAA, then a valuation paragraph, then you do KAA, then you do another valuation paragraph. I probably would do my first KAA on the impacts on suppliers, and then I would just do my second KAA on impacts on consumers, probably, because it sounds like the easiest way to split this. And here I'm just writing out my KAA for my first paragraph. So we went through quite a few points there. We went through, for example, costs. We went through delays in payments to food suppliers. aggressive price cutting. So you can, any of them work. As long as you build a chain of analysis around them, any of them work. I just choose to pick the one about the costs, basically. I just pick the one about they pay excessive amounts for packaging, and then I'm going to relate to costs. But for application also, so that's a bit of application I've just taken from the extract. But for application also, because the question does say, with the reference to figure 2, you could also just throw in a bit of figure 2 where, so what is it? What does figure 2 show? The proportion of food suppliers failed to meet the grocery code of conduct. So I would say, for example, Tesco has failed to meet 30% of food supplies. Yeah, whatever you want to say, just any application, any bit of figure usage, it works. So yeah, 100%. Okay, so the way I would go about this KA paragraph, so like I've written it out, so K is, so the way I'd start it, so like I said, this is going to be the impacts on suppliers paragraph. The way I'd start it is just a monopsony definition, and also one little fact here, Edexcel did not actually require you to know the monopsony diagram. It would actually work quite well here. It's not needed, of course, because monopsonies is not on your spec, but it depends what time of the year you're watching this video. If it's not too close to your exams, I would actually suggest you learn the monopsony diagram because it's quite useful, and it's really useful in like chains of analysis, for example. But if it's too close to your exams, you don't need to worry about it. But so your K, so the knowledge, I would start with just defining monopsonies. So I'd say like dominant buyer of goods in the market that use their monopsony power. They use their power as the sole buyers in the market to therefore exploit those food suppliers, knowing that food suppliers have no other choice, they have no one else to sell to, so they can use that power to exploit them. Then I would go on to say, like, but just adding a bit of application. For example, this is shown as, and then I'll just quote this, or quote a bit of figure 2 with regards to the GOC's exploitation stats. Not the GOC, I just mean this. GCOC. Then just like I was saying before, I'd pretty much say the same thing. So I'd go from my application. So forced to pay excessive amounts for packaging. Then I'd start my analysis. This means the costs for these food supplies is going to rise. If the cost for these food supplies is going to rise, this could lead to two different effects. One effect is that with costs rising, it could mean that these firms start making losses. If these firms start making losses, then you can maybe introduce short run shutdown points, long run shutdown point. They may move beyond their long run shutdown point, therefore be forced outside of the market, something like that. And then I'd also say another effect is with costs rising, it can also lead to quality falling. Why? And then explain the scenario I explained previously as when firms costs rise, they have a choice. Either they maintain profit margins or they basically let their profit margins decrease. And if they let their profit margins decrease, the way they do that is by lowering quality. Therefore, it could have knock-on effects. And maybe there's a knock-on effects, and the knock-on effects ultimately would be to the consumers. But since this paragraph is focused on suppliers, I probably wouldn't mention that here, and probably would actually, it's a good point to link into your second paragraph. So let's do the paragraph on KAA paragraph on consumers. Okay, so now just using our brains, let's try to think of some of the effects on consumers without even using the extract. So if these supermarkets are exploiting the food suppliers, so the supermarkets are getting lower prices, the supermarkets' costs are reducing, how is that going to translate onto consumers? So if you think about it, if supermarkets are paying less for their food supplies, it means that they can charge it at a lower price. This therefore means that consumers are probably being positively affected, and consumers are paying lower prices. You can link that to things like, the main thing you're going to link that to is consumer surplus as the main topic with consumers paying lower prices. But yeah, so it probably would just be positive effects on consumers as they pay lower prices. And then the other, we could actually mention the little negative effect that we mentioned earlier. Now actually, before we move on to the consumer side of things, of course we need to evaluate this, since in the 12 marker there are 4 evaluation marks. That's why I suggest you do one at the end of your first paragraph, one at the end of your second paragraph, so you can pick up 2 evaluation marks in both. But yeah, how would we evaluate this? So we're evaluating that basically, so what we're trying to do with evaluation, we're trying to say that the supermarkets are not to exploit their monopoly power, or we're trying to find a limitation basically of where they might not actually be able to exploit this monopoly power. And this again reminds me straight back to the extract, in which it talks about at the end, it links really well too. So in monopolies, one of the best evaluation points you can talk about is just CMA regulation, where monopolies can't exploit their powers with exploiting consumers with high prices, since CMA will regulate them. They will stop them exploiting consumers, and that's pretty much the exact same point I'm going to give here. So it talks about GCA, which is, I'm guessing, the regulatory body for groceries, and it says here, the GCA has the power to fine supermarkets up to 1% of their annual sales if they break the groceries code of conduct. So my main evaluation point here is going to be, however, this depends on the level of GOC regulation. As if the level of GOC regulation is high, this means supermarkets will not exploit their monopoly power, as they will be scared, they will be fearful of them being fined their 1% of annual revenue. Thus meaning the negative effects on these food suppliers, like the increase in costs, shouldn't actually be felt by these food suppliers. But another really interesting thing, which I actually went through earlier, is the monopoly definition. And the pure monopoly definition is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Whereas here, we're talking about monopoly power, but there's quite a few firms in this market. There's quite a few of these firms that are exerting this monopoly power. So you could actually just evaluate the definition saying that pure monopoly power, when we talk about monopolies, like the NHS, for example, even the NHS isn't a pure monopoly, because there's the NHS and then there's also a bit of private healthcare. But regardless, in this evaluation point, you could actually evaluate. However, this depends on the definition of monopoly power or definition of monopolies, as the definition of a monopoly is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Thus, as there are lots of firms here, such as Aldi, Sainsbury's, Lidl, there are several firms here. This does not align with the perfect definition of a monopoly. And I'm going to give you way too many points here. By the way, you only need to write one of these, but I just love evaluation because it can help students pick up so many marks, and it's such a big skill you need. But another evaluation point that's just popped into my head is a standard one I used to go through for every single question. If you don't know what I mean by a standard one, watch my A-star evaluation video, most viewed video on my channel, because it's the best video I've ever made. But basically the point is time frame. So it depends on the effects between the short run and the long run. So the way I'd word this here, I'd say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. As in the long run, and I'm going to explain it now, in the long run, is this very sustainable? Is it sustainable that these firms are being exploited? They're basically just about surviving? Not really. So in the long run, if these firms are being exploited too hard, they're going to leave the market and they're going to shut down. Therefore, in the long run, supermarkets are probably going to have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, so they all don't end up leaving. Since if all of these food suppliers are being exploited and they leave, there's no one to supply the supermarkets with food. So that's pretty much, I'd word that into like a few lines, saying that however, this depends on the time frame, as in the long run, supermarkets will have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, a reasonable appropriate price, as if they don't, there'll be no supplies left in the supermarket industry, thus meaning that supermarkets cannot operate, and of course affecting their profits, revenue, sales. But yeah, like I said, you only need one of those points. Just explain it in slight detail, and that should be your 2 evaluation marks for this paragraph back. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph, which is going to be on consumers. Now, before we even look at the extract, let's just use our brains on what the effect on consumers is going to be. So essentially, we know the supermarkets are exploiting their monopoly power on these food suppliers. So the supermarkets are lowering their costs. Because what does monopoly power do? It allows these firms to lower costs because they're paying them basically an unfair price. So if supermarkets have lower costs, what does it allow supermarkets to do? It allows supermarkets to have more margin, they have more of a buffer area, so it allows supermarkets to charge consumers lower prices. And what are the effects, what are the impacts of that? If consumers are charged lower prices, it means that you can talk about several different things. Consumer welfare, consumer surplus is improved. And that's basically a paragraph in itself without even having to look at the extract. And then remember back to the last paragraph where we mentioned a bit of if the suppliers' costs are high, this could be translated to worse quality. And if quality is worsened, it will mean that obviously that is going to have an effect on the consumer, isn't it? Since if consumers' vegetables are no longer good quality, it could have effect on like health, several effects on consumers basically. So you could actually write, if you want to write a negative effect on consumers, is that with the suppliers' costs rising, it's going to translate to worse quality for consumers. But yeah, let's have a read of the extract just to show you this, or just try to pick up any more points. Because we've pretty much read through the entire extract now, the main thing that pops into my mind is just this. That's the main bit of application I would use. So the price wars, so even this, aggressive price cutting strategies. There's been several price wars between the supermarkets, and like it says, the prices paid by consumers have fallen 1.7%. Therefore, the main paragraph I would write here is just the impact on consumers is that prices are falling, and then just explain the reasons why the prices are falling due to the monopoly power on suppliers. Therefore, it means that the supermarkets have lower costs. They can charge consumers lower prices. Also, there's heavy competition in this market. Therefore, with price wars, it means that they're undercutting each other, meaning that consumers are receiving even better prices, improving their surplus even more. Now, thinking about evaluation, lots of evaluation points here as well. This is why once you get evaluation, it's so easy. But you can use the time frame one. If you didn't use it last time, you can use it here, where we're talking about price wars. We're talking about prices dropping for consumers. But realistically, short run versus long run, how long is that going to last? In the short run, there probably are going to be quite a few price wars, but in the long run, how sustainable are those price wars? How sustainable are the constant drops in price for consumers? Since one of the main reasons that supermarkets will pursue price wars is for market share, market power. That is usually a short-term goal, whereas in the long term, supermarkets, they have shareholders. They will be more bothered about profits rather than just solely gaining market share. And an absolute classic one, one of the main ones in my A-star valuation video, I'm not just plugging in this for the sake of it, it's a very good video. But economics evaluation is all about assumptions. So we're constantly making assumptions from ceteris paribus to this. But one assumption we made is that as these supermarkets have the monopoly power, they're going to exploit the suppliers, and therefore they have lower costs, and they're going to pass these costs on to consumers. But in reality, even though the supermarkets have lower costs, they don't need to pass it on to consumers. They could just take basically an increased profit margin. So that's a really good evaluation, saying that however, this depends on the assumption that supermarkets are going to pass on this reduced cost to consumers, and that's an absolute A-star evaluation point right there. So that is a 12-mark question done. Now, I've said lots of points there. You obviously do not need to write all of that. You just need to write your 2 KA paragraphs, your 2 evaluations, and that is it. But this is more for revision, more to get your brain fired up in that economic sense. So then if a question like this comes up, a similar question comes up, you've gone through a lot of these points and you've understood a lot of these points, and obviously it's a very good revision. So now, moving on, the 8-mark question. Now, once you've answered the 12-mark question, have a read of this. This is very, very, very simple. So, examine measures that the government, might use to restrict the monopoly power of supermarkets, which is pretty much very similar to what we've just answered, so you can really bang this out quite quickly. So one measure the government could use is regulation. So like we know, with the application as well, so a bit of application here as well, they find them 1% of their annual revenue, 1% of annual. And yeah, that is literally just structure in a KA sense. And for the 8-mark question, you only really need 1 point. And if you want to go into depth with this point, that's completely fine. But now, just thinking about it, measures the government can use to restrict monopoly power of supermarkets. A really good thing with monopolies is actually very similar to monopolies. And what is a strategy we learn about to reduce the monopoly power in markets? So there's monopoly power. How do you define a monopoly? So a legal monopoly is a firm with more than 25% market share. A pure monopoly is a firm with 100% market share. So basically the problem in monopolies is that there's not enough firms in the market. Therefore, there's usually one dominant incumbent firm and it exploits consumers. And pretty much the same thing works in monopolies. So one way we can restrict the monopoly power of supermarkets is allow competition. Introduce competition in the supermarket industry. As if there's more firms in the supermarket industry, these food suppliers have more options to sell to. And if there's more options, if there's lots of different supermarkets, it means that the degree of monopoly power will greatly be reduced. As now, if Tesco's offering a stupidly low price, these suppliers, if you remember back to the extract actually, if you look at this, the last line, many food suppliers are reluctant to complain of fear of losing contracts with supermarkets, but this is why it works so well. But if they increase entrance, more competition in the market, it means that, like I said, if Tesco offers them a stupidly low price, they can say no to Tesco and go to one of the maybe 20 new supermarkets that will offer them a decent price. Therefore, like I said, it will reduce their monopoly power and therefore mean that, like I said, restrict the monopoly power of supermarkets. I just want to emphasize, you only need to do one of these points, just structure it in a KA sense, and then just write one little evaluation point, and that is more than enough for 8 marks. But it's really good, and I would 100% encourage doing this as you're practicing, you're revising with exam questions. This is exactly how it's going to be asked in the actual exam. So if you can practice, just brainstorm ideas with exam questions. Yeah, you won't need 1 point for 8 marker, but if whilst you're revising, it's a really good revision activity. But yeah, third one, another point I can think of, how can the government restrict monopoly power? So the problem is that these firms, the supermarkets, are paying the suppliers, the food suppliers, too low of a price. Now, what is a strategy? What is something the government can do to stop supermarkets paying the suppliers such a low price? It's the same strategy you would use in negative externalities to stop someone buying cigarettes, for example, in negative externalities questions. And there's lots of different strategies, but one of them is minimum prices, and here that works really well as well. So if you set a minimum price, so minimum price that suppliers can pay that supermarkets can pay these food suppliers, it means that it will really restrict, it will reduce the degree to which supermarkets have this monopoly power. And of course, if you don't want minimum prices, please do make sure to draw the diagram. Why? Because it's so simple. It will literally take you about 10 seconds to draw out price, quantity, minimum price. Remember, minimum price is always above the equilibrium. Why is it above the equilibrium? Because you want to increase the price that the supermarkets want to pay suppliers. If it's below the equilibrium, it does not make sense. Okay, so just label up the points on the diagram. Nice little diagram, and straight away, by looking at this, we have 2 valuation points at the end. How could you use this diagram to evaluate now? So we've said that a minimum price will restrict the monopoly power, but then also what happens in a minimum price? What is the difference between QD and QS now? That is excess supply, which means that you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the negative effects of the minimum price, as the minimum price will lead to excess supply by food suppliers. And what is that? Excess supply of food suppliers is wastage. Therefore, it means that there's going to be wastage of food. Therefore, it's going to be a misallocation of resources. You can even, if you really wanted to, you don't need to at all, by the way, here. It's only 2 marks of evaluation, so that would be completely fine. But just to get your brain sparking, you can link that to government failure, saying that, and that would be an example of government failure, because the government has intervened in the market trying to improve the allocation of resources, but actually led to worsened allocation of resources. And just thinking about a few more evaluation points. For regulation, very simple one. Regulatory capture depends on whether the regulators fall in, they may become fond of the firm they're regulating, therefore reduce the degree to which they actually regulate, like these firms like Tesco. With increased competition, I think a really good evaluation point would just be you could just evaluate the lack of monopoly power. It means that if now supermarkets no longer have this monopoly power, they're paying higher prices to the food suppliers, it means that supermarkets' costs are going to rise. This could lead to, and this is probably going to lead to, higher costs for consumers, therefore reduction in consumer welfare, and you can pretty much write that for any of them. But yeah, like I said, evaluation there is very simple. This 8 marker is very simple. Just make sure KA, and the biggest thing here pretty much, get it done in 8 minutes. And since the 12 marker we did before this is very similar to the 8 marker, I would even say you can get this done in like 5, 6, 7 minutes. Definitely you can save a bit of time here with the 8 mark question. Moving on to the 10 mark question, so 6D. Let's have a read of this. Assess the extent to which information gaps, and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste in the UK. So the main thing I'm picking up from just reading the question, just exam technique, is that it's asking me about 2 separate things. So information gaps and irrational behaviour. So usually in a 10 mark question, you can get away with the 1 KA paragraph, but since it's asked you specifically about 2 separate aspects, I would make sure to split into 2 paragraphs. Of course, you don't need to go as detailed since you're doing 2 paragraphs, but 100% I would split it into 2 paragraphs. Now, just reading the question, the first thing I am actually going to look for is whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are actually the main causes of food waste, because it says assess the extent, so that kind of maybe tells me it's not, but it could be. And the second thing is, I usually say a lot of these section B questions, you should have enough economics theory, your economics knowledge should be good enough to just answer the question without looking at the context. But here, this is an example of a context question where you 100% need the context to pick up the marks here. Just like all of the questions, you do need the context for application, but here, I think it's quite hard to guess what the question's actually asking you here. So the question has directed us towards extract B, so let's have a read of that. So again, we're looking for the main causes of food waste in the UK and whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. So extract piece of food waste in the supply chain. Let's have a read of this. So firstly, it says supermarkets are directly responsible for 0.2 million tons of food waste. So that's one of the causes, and I'm guessing that's one of the major causes of food waste. And then it tells us why they end up wasting food, so expiry dates. Okay, so then it says 4.1 million tons of food waste occurs, and this says due to the existence of information gaps. I'm just going to quickly skip this section and then look over to the second one, because of course the question said information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes of food wastage. So let's just check that. So 7 million tons of food are wasted. This suggests irrational behaviour. So okay, so the question, so we have now established that information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes, but now going back to the question, it's asking us the extent, so assess the extent to which information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. Now, I've got to admit, this is actually a bit of a harder question, because I would say slightly poorly worded, and there's not much economics theory to back it up. So here, what you're going to have to do is just use the context as much as possible. So I'm just going to read through that paragraph again, because we're assessing the extent to which, we'll start with just information gaps, are a main cause of food wastage. There's not much, when you first look at it, there's not much economics theory to back that up with. But now let's have a read of the context. So we've read up until here. Now, this basically goes on to tell us how the supermarkets are looking to solve this information gap. And that is probably what I am actually going to write about. So the way I would do this is, okay, so just KA structure. So I would start with just a bit of knowledge. The knowledge would be defining information gaps. There's also different types of information gaps. There's asymmetrical information. For example, when you're buying a car, the seller of the car has a lot more information on the car than you as the buyer, as the seller has used the car. He knows probably ins and outs of the car, whilst you as a buyer can only judge the car and what he's presented, what he's presented to you. I define it by saying when one party in an information, so the buyer or the seller, does not have complete information to make an informed decision, therefore it leads to a misallocation of resources. Then I'll just have my topic sentence. I believe information gaps are the main cause of food wastage due to a lack of complete market information. And that is from this. The way I've got that is this line here. Basically, the supply and demand of food. So this involves improving forecasts for supply and demand of food. And what that is saying is that food is wasted due to information gaps, but due to basically that the supermarkets don't have complete market information, as they don't know how much to supply at certain seasons, as they do not know how much demand there will be. Therefore, they might oversupply, they might undersupply. Well, they will likely oversupply, thus leading to that excess supply is the food wastage. And that's basically how I would develop my chain of analysis. So just linking this sentence in the extract as much as possible to information gaps. So talking about the excess supply by supermarkets as they have a lack of market information, thus meaning that excess supply is of course food wastage. Then I would also flip it onto the consumer side. So consumers maybe demand too much food because things like they don't understand how like food labels work, they don't understand when food expires, thus they might just buy an excess amount of food as they don't fully understand the labels. A great example of this is like bread. Bread has a best before date, which might be in 3 days, but after those 3 days, you can still eat it, and there's a lot of times where the bread will be completely fine. It's just that an estimate of when the bread is in like prestige condition is in those 3-day period, but it doesn't go moldy. It's not unhealthy to eat that bread after 3 days, and that is probably, and giving something like that in an example, is what's leading to the excess demand, as individuals might just buy too much bread, as I think in this 3 days I'm only going to be able to eat this much, but then I need a new loaf of bread for those next, I don't know, 7 days. And like I said, this is definitely a bit of a harder 10-mark question, since there's not much economics theory, and it's a lot of just like inferences, a lot of just using the context and extracting as much as possible. And then of course your 10-mark question will have 4 marks reserved for application, so a little evaluation point at the end of this paragraph. And the one I would pick is 100% time frame, as it really is the easiest. I'll just talk about, however, in evaluation this depends on the time frame, as if we're talking about information gaps, we can say in the short run there's likely to be these information gaps, whereas in the long run, when these supermarkets over a longer period of time, when they gain more market information, where they've tried and tested different things like adjusting the supply and demand, they'll have a backlog of like statistics information which they can use, which will therefore reduce the information gap and almost solve the market failure, thus meaning there's no longer excess supply, thus solving the food wastage. So basically I'd word it something like, so however in evaluation this depends on whether the long run can solve the market failure or the information gap. Then moving on, like I said, we're going to do 2 paragraphs here since this question split them up, and this is on irrational behaviour, and this is much easier. as whenever you think of irrational behaviour, you should think of these 3 points. So, consumers may not behave rationally. Why? Number one, consideration of influence of other people's behaviours. So, why can this lead to food wastage? So, for example, fashion trends, maybe a big influencer's buying lots of bread, and that's the only food I can think of. Maybe one influencer buying lots of bread, and now since people are seeing this influencer buy bread, since it's a trend, they end up buying bread. But then when they take that bread home, they realise they don't actually like bread. So due to the influence of other people, due to almost like herd behaviour, they start buying bread, and this leads to food wastage. Then secondly, the importance of habitual behaviour. So consumers might be used to buying too much food. They might be used to throwing away food every single week, but since it's a habit, they keep on doing it week on week, and it's very hard to break out those habits. Then lastly, consumer weakness at computation. This basically means the lack of mental processing power a human has when making a decision. So for example, the customer might be deciding whether to buy 1 loaf of bread or 2 loaf of breads. But since it's a hard decision and they don't fully know whether they're going to eat more bread this week, less bread this week, just to be safe, they'll probably pick 2 loaves of bread, but that will very likely lead to more wastage. So any one of those factors you can build a chain of analysis around. You can even throw in 2 of them or even all of them if you'd really like, and that would be enough for the 6 marks in your 10-mark question. And just to pick up those last 2 evaluation marks, I think a really easy evaluation here is just using like your previous point, just talking about a bit about providing information. So one way you can reduce irrational behaviour is by providing information. For example, just maybe prompting individuals saying, do you really need this many loaves of bread in a supermarket? Just having like a little sign, something like that, just providing information, maybe providing an average amount of bread that each household uses, therefore it helps with individuals' decision making, therefore them less likely to buying too much bread, and therefore leading to food wastage. And that is a wrap for the 10-mark question. Moving on to the last question in section B, and the biggest question there is, the 15-mark question. So let's have a shot at this. So discuss the likely problems, so we're looking for problems, for Sainsbury's and Morrison's if the suggested merger, so we're talking about a merger between them, goes ahead. Refer to figure 1, extract C, and your own knowledge. Now, for these bigger answer questions like your 10 and your 15, I don't usually try to brainstorm too much, even though I could probably think of quite a few problems with mergers, such as monopoly power, lack of competition, diseconomies of scale, but I would use a context straight away. Why? Because the 50-mark question in the context, in the extract, they try to direct you towards a point, as they want you to speak about some certain points. So just brainstorming points here would be a bit of a waste of time. I want to see in the extract what they're trying to get me to answer about, and then I'm just going to drive those points, get those points out of the extract and speak about them. So basically, the examiner wants you to speak about certain points, and they're going to be in the extract, and let's go and find them. So we're talking about extract C, so let's have a look at that. It's talking about figure 1 and extract C. We'll look at figure 1 later. Actually, we'll look at figure 1 first. So figure 1, what we look at here, so a merger, so problem between a merger between Sainsbury's and Morrison's. So here we're talking about market share. Let's just identify the market share of Sainsbury's and Morrison's. That is, so, well, the main thing is that them two together, 10 plus 16, if we just round it, is 26%. How do you define a legal monopoly? A legal monopoly is a firm with more than 25% market share. So one problem is that they will become a legal monopoly now. And then, of course, like I said before, there's quite a few problems with becoming a monopoly, like exploiting consumers with higher prices. They have a lot more market power. Then it can lead to lack of competition, lack of innovation, things like that. But then now let's have a look at extract C, which you also mentioned. So proposed merger activity in the supermarket sector. Let's see if there's anything valuable here. So they've recommended a merger. They claim it would lead to, so they claim it would lead to increased economies of scale. But remember, what was the question asking for? The question was asking for problems, but that looks like it's quite a good evaluation point because the extract states it. Market power for business, such merger. Okay, so this basically talks about regulation and how it's likely to go ahead these days. So the second paragraph is about the challenges, which is basically problems. So they should actually give us something to answer the question with. So there's considerable overlap between the locations. So that can lead to like wastage, inefficiencies, like diseconomy of scale, you could even say. Then a large company would require rationalization and coordination of 100,000 employees. Yep, so like lack of efficiency, diseconomy of scale. So a new expensive IT system is likely to be required, and the underlying difficult market trends would remain in the food retailing industry. That last point is very interesting. Why? Because if we think chronologically back, what was the main like theme of this context? It was talking about how basically Aldi and Lidl, the discount supermarkets, are basically taking over. They're taking market share, and these the larger ones like Morrison's, Asda, Sainsbury's, they are losing market share. So here we're talking about a merger between Sainsbury's and Morrison's, but that's not going to stop the apparent fact that these two supermarkets are losing market share anyway to the new Aldi and Lidl, to the discounter stores. So I'm just going to give you a few points here you can write about. I'm not going to write the full chain of analysis out, but like I said, one point there is definitely this one. So underlying market trends. So Aldi and Lidl are still taking over, and the main thing is a merger does not solve this. A merger will not help these two firms. Yes, they will join together, but slowly by slowly, year after year, Aldi and Lidl, these discount stores, will be taking more market share. And you can develop a nice chain of analysis around that. A really good evaluation point I was thinking here is you could say, however, this depends on a firm's objectives. As with the new, because if Sainsbury's and Morrison merge, they have more market power, and with this new market power, they could pursue a different objective. Like, for example, they could pursue sales maximizing, therefore reducing their prices. So they could basically match Aldi and Lidl's prices. Therefore, in the long run, and with different business objectives, they could actually compete with Aldi and Lidl in the long run, and with different business objectives. And another great point, and this would probably be my main point for a paragraph, 27.4% market share when they merge. So this means it's a legal monopoly. And in this paragraph, I would probably talk about what is a problem with Sainsbury's and Morrison's becoming a legal monopoly. There's several problems like exploiting consumers. So of course, with that monopoly power, since they have so much of that market share, they can charge a higher price, and consumers, maybe they have a degree of inelastic demand, therefore forced to buy it, and then lack of innovation. The reason they may have a lack of innovation is due to their high market share, due to their already very high profits. There's no incentive for them to reinvest. There's no incentive for them to become dynamically efficient, invest into research and development. Therefore, in the long run, this can lead to many negative effects like consumers' the quality of goods being worse. Then, of course, it did mention here where there's basically going to be problems with, if you think about it, there's Morrison's and Sainsbury's. They usually, a lot of these supermarkets are quite close. There's two supermarkets in a 1 minute walking distance is quite a big waste, isn't it? And then merging the stores together, merging the employees together, etc, etc. But if I was writing this paragraph point on them becoming a legal monopoly, a really easy evaluation here is, I could actually relate a bit more to the extract as well, is about regulation. So it talks about GCA regulation somewhere, so whatever it's called, the groceries, it's in one of these extracts. GCA, the Groceries Code Adjudicator, or any regulatory body. Basically, if my evaluation point would be, however, in evaluation, this depends on the level of GCA regulation, as if the level of regulation is high, it will mean that even after the merger, Sainsbury's and Morrison's will not be able to exploit consumers with high prices. They may be forced to reinvest into research and development. Therefore, it will stop the negative effects of them becoming a legal monopoly. Another point, of course, from the extract would be just this point regarding to the locations of stores, enlarged company, hundreds of thousands of employees. So basically, if you think about it, there's lots of Sainsbury's and Morrison's very close together, like maybe a minute walk from each other. If they merged, it would be very inefficient to keep them both open. So it would lead to massive diseconomy of scale, especially with employees having like a new work culture, etc, etc. So this would be a massive problem for the firm. So you could definitely write a paragraph on diseconomies of scale. And then, like I was saying earlier, a really easy evaluation point, if you're going to write a diseconomy of scale paragraph, would literally be the extract. So it basically talks about diseconomy of scale here, but then in the first paragraph, it talks about increased economies of scale due to more market power, etc, etc. So you could say, in fact, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of economies of scale, as due to, for example, purchasing economies of scale, since they have more market power, since they buy in larger quantities, they can negotiate lower prices, and with lower prices, it reduces their LRAC, and that would, of course, be an example of economies of scale. And then the last point you could also speak about, literally it just reminded me looking at the questions, which is this question we answered earlier, which is restricting the monopoly power of supermarkets. Now, we talked about monopoly power and that they're going to become a legal monopoly, but also their monopoly power. So these supermarkets already have this massive degree of monopoly power, but now with these supermarkets merging, it's just going to further expedite, it's going to further increase that monopoly power, therefore food supply is being further exploited, and that's obviously a massive problem of the merger. Then if you want to evaluate that monopsony PowerPoint, you can literally use one of the points used in the monopsony 6C, so one of the points used here, since evaluation still works. But yeah, that's loads of points I've just given you for that 15 mark question. Of course, to get 15 marks, you do not need to use all these points. Just pick 2 KA paragraphs, so 2 problems, and then 2 evaluations, and that should be enough for 15 out of 15 if you write in enough detail. Moving on to section C. Of course, in section C, you'll be given 2 25 mark questions and you'll have to pick one of them to answer. Now, how do you make the decision and how do you efficiently, so not wasting too much time, make the decision on which 25 mark question you can pick? And 100%, and the obvious choice, is the one that you can score better on. And the way to try to guess or try to estimate which one you can score better on is simply the one you're more confident with writing chains of analysis for. As a general rule is, the more chains of analysis you can write, hopefully the better you'll score. So what I would do before picking a 25 mark question, I would read both 25 mark questions and try and link them to a specific topic. So let's do this here. So number 7. I'm just going to go directly to the question. Evaluate the likely microeconomic effects of such a tax. And then in the stimulus, they talk about imposition on a 20% tax on soft drinks which contain a high level of sugar. So that tells me right now, I'm just going to try and link that to a big topic. What big topic does that link to? So we're talking about taxes, then we're talking about sugary drinks. What is sugary drink? A demerit good? How do we solve negative externalities? It's what's one policy to solve negative externalities? It's a tax. So that links mostly to me to market failure. Now let's look at the second 25 mark question. To what extent do you agree with this statement and refer to the industry? So the question, revenue maximization is more realistic business objective than profit maximization. So the main topic there is probably business objectives, but the bigger topic there is market structure, so like monopolies. So now, once I've identified the big topics, it makes thinking of points and planning much easier, which I would suggest every single student to do. I emphasize this all the time, but I've never had an A-star student which doesn't plan. But now you know the big topics in both these questions. Now it's just about what you're more confident with, what you've done most practice with. So you need to make a decision whether you're more confident. Maybe you've done loads of essays on market failure, then pick the market failure question, and vice versa. Since we're practicing, we're going to attempt both 25 mark questions, and let's start with question 7. So let's break down this question into some smaller chunks. So evaluate the likely microeconomic effects. So this is an effects question of such a tax. And like I said before, this reminds me a lot of market failure. Why? Because in the stimulus it talks about public health. So like the public, you think about welfare loss, you could think about social welfare, private welfare, for example. But then, so the Public Health England recommended an imposition of a 20% tax on the sale of soft drinks that contain a high level of sugar. So now this is the planning stage of my paragraph. So when I hear all those things, like I said before, sugar is demerit, has negative externalities. How do we solve those negative externalities via tax? And the question is asking us the effects of the tax. So basically, for one of my paragraphs, all I'm going to do is, using the negative externality diagram, which you should know, you should be quite confident with, I'm going to explain the effects, run through the effects of the tax, how it affects. So when we move from the normal market equilibrium to now the socially efficient equilibrium with the tax, and explain that entire market failure theory, embed it into that question, and I know it'll pick me up a lot of marks in this question. And the way I'd get this started, and the main thing to link all this to, is the externality diagram. So let's have a shot at this just to help you explain it. So of course, what's on the axes? Y-axis would be cost slash benefits, and that's the main thing. It's not actually cost slash revenue for market failure diagrams, it's cost slash benefits. I always see when marking papers that little mistake usually by students. And then quantity or output, whatever you want to put, on the y-axis. So then let's get started with this diagram. So supply equals what? Supply equals MPC, so supply equals marginal private cost, and then our demand curve equals, in this case, in negative production externalities, equals MPP, so marginal private benefit, and it also equals MSB, which is marginal social benefit. Okay, and then of course we have our last curve which completes a negative production externality diagram, which is the MSC, the marginal social cost. So of course, in negative production externalities, the social cost is higher than the private cost. Now, of course, here you would label up the quantities and the welfare loss triangle. A little trick I've picked up over the years to never get your welfare loss triangle wrong. and it's a bit tricky to understand initially, but some of you will get it, is you go from your market to equilibrium. So where's the market equilibrium? Market equilibrium is simply where your supply equals demand. So this scenario where S equals MPC is equal to demand equals MPB equals MSB. So basically at this point here, so to work out your welfare loss 100% accurately every single time, doesn't matter which externality diagram you use, you go from your market to equilibrium up or down to the curve you've changed. So in this scenario you would go straight up because the curve you've changed is always going to be the social curve. So if you think about in positive externalities, your social curve shifts rightwards, it shifts to down, whereas in negative externalities it shifts upwards. So the curve you change, which is your social curve, and then so you go from your market equilibrium to the curve you changed, and that will be the welfare loss. Now that might sound really tricky to some people, but some people will understand it. So what does this diagram show? This diagram shows, firstly, let's think about the real simple things. It shows the free market equilibrium, where the market was before the government intervened, just where the market normally operates, which is where supply equals demand. Now, out where supply equals demand, at this red point, which I'm labelling here, where is price and where is quantity? And quantity here is the amount being produced, because negative production externality diagram. So at this point here, we are producing QE. Now, if you look at QE, what does QE represent? What is the discrepancy between QE and QSE? That discrepancy represents overproduction. So basically what we're saying, at quantity QE, we're producing too many sugary drinks, and we want to be producing QSE. What does QSE represent? QSE represents the socially efficient equilibrium. This is where we're producing optimum amount of sugary drinks, in this example, for society. We're producing the right amount for society, where society, most importantly, doesn't suffer a welfare loss. And where do we find this welfare loss? Here. So when we overproduce, when we produce at QE instead of producing at QSE, so when we undertake this overproduction, it leads to this triangle of welfare loss, which of course is negative for society. So now you've shown the examiner, you understand what the problem is. So what we're going to do, we're going to then, therefore the government intervenes in the market and intervenes with a tax. So how do we show that? We show that as adding the tax here. So the government, of course, does not want this welfare loss, as its cost in the government is negative for society. So how is the government going to respond to this? The main policy the government uses in market failure to solve the market failure is a tax. So tax is going to be implemented here. So MPC plus tax. Why is it called MPC plus tax? Because producers have a private cost of production, and by taxing, they put the tax on the producers. Therefore, it's more costly for these producers to produce, therefore shifting the MPC curve to now MPC plus tax. And the reason they shift it to exactly where MSC is, as this is the optimum point, as now this means producers are now producing at QSE and at price PSE, which means they're now operating at a socially efficient equilibrium, meaning there's no welfare loss, and thus their negative externality has now been internalized. And these are all microeconomic effects. All this chain of analysis has just been examples of microeconomic effects of the government implemented a tax. So one microeconomic effect, if you want to put it, the overarching effect, is that the government can internalise negative externalities. Now, of course, in your 25 mark questions, there are 9 marks allocated to evaluation. So how would I evaluate this? And it's a classic evaluation point here, especially with it being related to sugary drinks. So the way I would step-by-step word it is saying, however, and this is, if I had to give you an example of a pure A-star evaluation point, it would probably be this. I'm saying it off the top of my head, so it might not be worded perfectly, but it's an absolute gem of an evaluation point. So the way I'd word it is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the price elasticity of demand of the good. Sugary drinks have an addictive nature, thus their PD is likely to be between 0 and 1. So it's likely to be less than 1, thus meaning they are inelastically demanded. So basically, sugary drinks are inelastically demanded. This therefore means despite a sharp rise in price, quantity demanded will not fall as intended, thus leading to government failure, as the government has intervened in this market and not achieved their goal of improving consumers' health, stopping the consumption of sugary drinks. And that last bit really shows the examiner you have an appreciation of what's actually going on. As yes, even though with this sugar tax, we're going to raise the loads of tax revenue, but the main overarching goal of the sugar tax isn't to raise tax revenue, is to help consumers' health, as the tax revenue they gain is going to be nothing compared to how much it costs the NHS for obesity, for treating type 2 diabetes. So basically, the main goal of this tax is to improve consumers' health, improve the public's health. So the main aim of this tax is to improve consumers' health, but since the good is inelastically demanded, they will gain lots of tax revenue, but quantity demanded won't actually fall significantly, thus meaning we haven't actually reached the intended goal of the tax, which is a reduction in the overconsumption. Moving on to the second paragraph. So, if we read the question again, evaluate the likely microeconomic effects. And those two words, microeconomic effects of the tax. What I'm thinking here now is I'm thinking about the different shareholders in the economy. So if you're managers, you have your CEOs, you have your employees, you have your consumers, you have your producers, and specifically those last two. Consumers and producers are of course the most affected by taxes. And just explaining and of course using a diagram to illustrate this, and this is why strong diagram theory, knowing how to manipulate your diagrams can really, and it's really needed to pick up those top marks. But yeah, I would probably focus this last and second paragraph on just put the effects on of the tax, the producer burden, the producer burden and the consumer burden of the tax. So all I'm going to do is a simple supply and demand diagram and just shifting the supply curve inwards to show the tax. And then I'm going to represent using the quantities and the price, the producer and consumer burden. So just simple supply. Then, of course, in your actual exam, you can write out supply and demand, but we're just illustrating here, so I'm not going to write the entire thing out. And then, of course, what does a tax do to supply? Increases producer's cost of production. That will shift supply inwards to S plus tax. And now let's label all this up. Okay, so this is all the simple labels done. Now, how do you show the consumer and producer surplus? Now, in this video, I'm not going to explain why they are where they are. I'm just going to show you it as it's just exam technique, basically. So all you have to do is go from your new equilibrium, which is S plus tax, so where P1 and Q1 intersect, so where S plus tax and demand intersects. So basically, this point here, you just go straight down until you hit your supply curve, and then go left from there. So basically, you're trying to make like a little rectangle type thing. So basically just go left from here, and now this is how you show your consumer and producer burden. And this purple box here, so this box here would be the consumer burden, and this purple box here represents the consumer burden. So what is the purple box? It's just up until, so above the PE price, so from the PE price till the P1 price, and if you want to put A, B, you can put A, B there, so P1, A, B, PE. And quickly, just always question yourself what these things mean. What does consumer burden actually mean to you? It's the proportion of the tax paid by consumers in terms of higher prices. So how much of the tax the consumers are actually paying. And then the box below that, so this box here, we can label this up, and this is of course the producer burden. And in economics, you constantly need to be questioning your assumptions, especially in evaluation. It's the most effective way to evaluate. And here we're assuming that producers are going to pass some of the price of the tax onto consumers. So some of the tax is being passed onto consumers, as if the producers just decided to internalize the tax, therefore there would be no consumer burden of the tax. Now, since this question is quite general about just the microeconomic effects of the tax, you could even label this diagram further, which is all this area, so pretty much all this box here, which my pen will not decide to label. So pretty much all this box here, so all this box we've labelled, what else does this represent? This represents government revenue. So this is the government tax revenue they're gaining from the tax. And if you want it to be technical, the area is P1, A, C, D. So that's basically just this, basically both the boxes, is the government revenue from the tax. And this is another effect you can talk about in this question. Maybe you can talk about how they can allocate this tax revenue. So you can say they can use this sugar tax revenue to maybe subsidise firms that are making sugar-free drinks, therefore allowing for more substitutes in the market, so individuals substitute away from those sugary drinks to now sugar-free alternatives. Then also in the diagram, if you want to go a bit more in depth with producers, let's think about revenue. So how do we build up revenue? Revenue, of course, a very simple equation, is price times quantity. So let's try to think about where was producers' revenue before the tax was implemented. So before the tax was implemented, like I said, it's price times quantity. So let's just ignore this side of the diagram. Let's just think about before the tax was implemented. So where was producer's price? Producer's price was PE. And where was producer's quantity? It was QE. So basically this entire box here was producer's revenue. So if you want to be technical with the annotations, you say producer's revenue before was PE, E, QE, F. So this box was producer's revenue before, But now, what is producers' revenue after the tax? And now this is a classic one that catches students out. So even though price is now P1, remember this entire box is going to the government in terms of tax revenue. So what are producers actually getting? Producers are only actually getting C. So producers' revenue after the tax has been implemented is this small box of CDQ1F. So CDQ1F is the producer's revenue after the tax. And then, of course, the most obvious thing on the diagram, which you probably would mention, is this triangle here, which is the deadweight loss caused by the government as they've reduced quantity from QE to Q1. But simply, the triangle of ADE is the triangle of deadweight loss. That was just me briefly explaining the diagram. Now you put all that knowledge into a well-structured, organised chain of analysis. Imagine how many marks you can pick up. The sky's your limit. Well, 25 out of 25 is your limit. But it just shows good diagram theory, that knowing how to construct chain of analysis, good content knowledge can really make that essay easy. And then, of course, like I said before, there are 9 marks allocated in 25 markers for evaluation. Here, there should be no problem with you evaluating. There are not thousands, but hundreds of different great evaluation points here. One evaluation point, a few that just comes to my head off the top of my head, like before I mentioned, the assumptions. So assuming the tax is passed on to consumers, producers could just internalise the tax, thus not increase the price. That's a great one. And then the different size of the tax is a great one always. So for example, we're assuming the tax is at S plus tax. What if the tax was here? It totally changes the dynamic. What if the tax is too big? What if the tax is too small? And things like government failure, you can talk about the law of unintended consequences. So by the government taxing sugary drinks, it could lead to things like black markets forming, therefore meaning that the government lose out on tax revenue, people are still over consuming, and basically the government, again, it's a misallocation of resources. Another absolute classic, I only wanted to give one evaluation point here, but a classic one you have to include if anything to do with taxes is regressiveness, income inequality. You can even draw a Lorenz curve, maybe Gini coefficient, add in there. But taxes, in the nature of taxes, they are regressive. Why? Because they impact every single individual equally. And if you impact every single individual equally, say, because in this stimulus, they're saying this is a 20% tax. So every single individual, whether you are Alan Sugar, or whether you are some really poor immigrant that's just moved into London, you're going to be paying that 20% sugar tax. Is that fair? That new immigrant that might make £10 a week is paying the same amount of sugar tax as Alan Sugar. And Alan Sugar is a rich person, and I just realised he has sugar in his name. That wasn't meant to be a joke, but let's make a scenario. There's a really rich person. He's paying the same amount of sugar tax in a percentage as a poor individual who might be making £10, and that rich person is making maybe $1 million plus a year. So we say that sugar tax is a larger percentage of that individual's income. So that low income individual is a larger percentage of their income, therefore disproportionately affects this lower income individual, thus has a regressive effects. It's regressive in its nature since it affects the low income households, the low income individuals a lot more than the high income individuals, as that maybe like we've shown here, that consumer burden, the percentage that consumers pay of this tax, yeah, maybe it's only 20% increase on your Sprite can, but that 20% might be 10% of someone's income, and compared to a really rich individual like Alan Sugar, it might be 0.0001% of his income. So it's not going to affect him basically at all, but it's going to disproportionately affect this low income individual, which will widen the income inequality gap, which is obviously something we do not want. But of course, in the UK, if you think about some real world application, the income inequality gap is definitely widening. Especially, it's a really good bit of application to read up on, and just really good stats, especially after COVID. In COVID, the UK created about 895 billion worth of new money in quantitative easing. Where was a lot of that money allocated towards? A lot of it ended up on those rich individuals' pockets, basically, especially with like things like dodgy NHS contracts, dodgy just contracts by Boris Johnson in general, meaning that the rich got richer. And of course, in COVID, you can think about the cost of living crisis. Great base of application. Think about 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation. Who is that going to affect the most? Again, the low-income households, the poor suffer, and the rich get richer. Also in COVID, high interest rates, 5.25%. What does that mean? The people who have got loans out, they have to pay more interest on their loans. Again, who's likely to have lots of loans out? Low income individuals. Again, poor get poorer. But I'm not Greta Thunberg, but they are really good stats for your essays to know about just general, especially I would 100%, especially for your macro paper, 100% revise COVID, revise the statistics around it, since there are some absolute gems in there. Alright, moving on to the second 25 mark question. Now, I've had a read of it. So revenue maximization is the most realistic business objective, then profit maximization for many businesses. This is a very dull 25 mark question. I'm going to go through it briefly, as if I was doing this paper, I feel like 90% of the students should do tax, and then a few weird students who probably are on like e-grades probably going to do this question. But if you do this question, that's your choice. But I just don't think there's much to speak about. The main thing you are obviously going to use and manipulate as much as possible is going to be your cost/revenue diagram, and you will pick up obviously a few marks for just showing where revenue maximization is, where the profit maximization is. Let's draw them on. So, of course, profit maximization is at the point where MC equals AC, which you would go from that point, go up, then go left, and this would now be our box of super normal profit, and we'll label that up, label that P max, representing the price at where we profit maximize, and label that Q max, which is the quantity where we profit maximize. Now, where do we revenue maximize? We revenue maximize where MR equals what? MR equals 0. So how do we show that? So we go where MR equals 0, which is obviously where MR intersects the x-axis, and then you just go straight up from there until you hit your AR curve, and then you go left, and now that would be the P-rev, I would say. P-rev being the price at where we revenue maximize. Now, as you can see, if you're looking at the box super normal profit, the profit maximization box is obviously the purple box, and the revenue maximization box would be the red box. So as you can see, when you're revenue maximizing, the quantity is slightly higher, price is slightly lower. There's thousands of different things you talk about here. So like consumer welfare is improved. You can even add in other business objectives like sales maximizing, allocative efficiency, dynamic efficiency, allocative productive efficiency, just to contrast the things. And with my Edexcel students, I'm always banging on about learning examples, real world application, industries, different countries, fact files. The reason is, you get questions like this, refer to an industry, and if you're not using as much and it's all from your knowledge, there's obviously no context here, you need to know really decent industries. Like, I think what a lot of students did for this, when I remember back in the days, banking, whenever my students, because a lot of students know about banks, it's a good industry to refer to, but you need to have any sort of industry you want, you need to have an industry to refer to. And with regards to industries, that is one reason why, that could be one of your points, that we revenue maximize over sale maximizing depending on the industry. As in different industries, it may be impossible to like profit maximize, and it may be like a valid objective to revenue maximize, vice versa. And another big one that comes to mind when you're thinking about why would firms revenue maximize over profit maximizing, regulation. Think about the CMA. CMA obviously does not want consumers being exploited, and will find, they'll name and shame firms that exploit consumers, that have that monopoly power to exploit consumers. Thus, if a firm is revenue maximizing, as we can see on the diagram, they have a lower price. They don't restrict quantity as much. There's less scarcity in the market, thus meaning that they're less likely to be caught up by regulatory bodies. There's not less likely to be named and shamed. Like, with being named and shamed, why does that affect the firm? It could affect brand image, therefore reduce demand, therefore reduce revenues, reduce profits, etc., etc. But yeah, so with revenue maximizing, they're less likely to be regulated or like named and shamed by regulatory bodies like the CMA. And a big one here would, of course, be the principal agent problem, where large firms would usually revenue maximize and smaller firms are more likely to profit maximize due to things like the divorce of ownership and control. And then if you wanted to do, you could do a paragraph saying you disagree with the statement and saying why profit maximization is a more realistic business objective. You could just relate it back to the classical economic assumption. What is a classical economic assumption? That firms are profit maximizers, thus will profit maximize. Then also, again, is to do with the industry. If you think about something like Tesco, a legal monopoly, or like any sort of monopoly industry, a firm that has monopoly power is very likely to profit maximize. Why? They can exploit that monopoly power, they can use that monopoly power to charge high prices, gain high profits, etc., etc. And that's just a brief summary of some points I would go into for this 25 mark question.